If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Eleanor Reed, and I never should have stopped at that motel on Route 26. I keep telling myself that if my old Chevrolet hadn't broken down just as the sun was setting, I'd never have found myself tangled up in the nightmare that followed. But maybe that's not true. Maybe. As a photographer who's always searching for the story behind every picture, I would have stumbled upon it anyway. It was October 1958, and I was driving through Nebraska on my way to photograph harvest festivals for Life magazine. The golden cornfield stretched as far as I could see, and the setting sun painted everything in warm oranges and reds. I probably would have found it beautiful if my car hadn't started making that awful clanking noise. Please don't break down. Please don't break down, I kept thinking, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But life doesn't work that way, does it? The engine made one final wheeze, like an old man's last breath, and that was it. Steam started rising from under the hood, and I had no choice but to pull over. I grabbed my camera bag. I never go anywhere without it, and stepped out onto the dusty shoulder of Route 26. The corn stalks rustled in the chilly autumn wind, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out. That's when I saw the sign, Harvest Moon Motel, 1 mile ahead vacancy. What luck? I thought at the time. What terrible luck, I know now. The walk wasn't bad, but my sensible shoes weren't made for hiking, and my wool skirt kept catching burrs from the roadside weeds. As I walked, I took a few photos of the sunset. That's what I do when I'm nervous. I take pictures. Through my lens, everything feels safer, more distant somehow, like I'm watching a movie instead of living it. The motel appeared around the bend, a long, L-shaped building with peeling white paint and dark windows that reminded me of empty eye sockets. An old neon sign buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly red glow. In the parking lot, there was only one other car, a shiny Buick that looked out of place against the rundown backdrop. The office bell jingled as I walked in, and the sound seemed too cheerful for a place like this. Behind the desk sat Mrs. Blackwood, though I didn't know her name then. She was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back, so tight it looked painful. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to the Harvest Moon," she said, her voice as dry as the autumn leaves outside. "Just you tonight?" I nodded, explaining about my car. As she checked me in, I noticed something odd on the wall behind her, an old farming tool, like a scythe, but with strange markings carved into its handle. When I raised my camera to take a picture, Mrs. Blackwood moved surprisingly quickly, stepping into my frame. "No photographs inside, please," she said firmly. Hotel policy. That should have been my first real warning. In my line of work, when someone doesn't want their picture taken, they usually have something to hide. The only other guest, as I would soon learn, was a traveling salesman named Thomas Walsh. I met him that evening while I was trying to use the payphone to call a mechanic. He seemed normal enough, friendly, middle-aged, with a bow tie that was slightly crooked. We chatted about the weather and the harvest season, and he mentioned he'd be staying a few days to sell his wares to local farmers. "Strange place, isn't it?" he whispered, glancing around. "Those symbols on the barn out back. Have you seen them?" I hadn't, but I would soon enough. As I headed to my room that night, key clutched in my hand like a lifeline, I heard something that made me freeze. From somewhere beneath the motel, maybe from the basement or lower, came the sound of people chanting. The words were too muffled to make out, but the rhythm was unmistakable, like a heartbeat, like a prayer. It's probably just the radio, I told myself, or the wind playing tricks. But as I locked my door and double-checked the windows, I knew I was lying to myself. Something was wrong at the Harvest Moon Motel, and part of me, the part that had won awards for uncovering stories nobody else wanted to tell, knew I wasn't going to be able to leave until I figured out what it was. I just didn't know then how much that curiosity would cost me. Sleep didn't come easy that first night. Every creak of the old motel made my eyes snap open, and the chanting I'd heard earlier kept playing in my head like a broken record. Around midnight, I gave up trying to rest and did what I do best. I decided to take some pictures. The motel room was cold, so I pulled on my cardigan and grabbed my camera. Just a few shots of the property at night, I told myself. Nothing risky. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself again. The hallway was quiet except for the buzz of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. I tiptoed past the other rooms, my camera hanging around my neck. That's when I noticed something strange. Thomas Walsh's door was slightly open, and his room was dark. "Mr. Walsh," I whispered, but there was no answer. I should have just walked away. That's what any sensible person would have done. Instead, I pushed the door open a little wider. The room looked exactly like mine, but his suitcase was open on the bed, clothes scattered everywhere like he'd left in a hurry. A noise from outside made me jump. Through the window, I saw lights moving near the old barn Mrs. Blackwood had been so protective of earlier. Shadowy figures were carrying something large. Farming equipment maybe, but at this time of night? I slipped outside, staying close to the walls. The autumn air was bitter cold now, and my breath came out in little clouds. As I got closer to the barn, I could hear voices, low murmurs that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The harvest must be completed, someone was saying. The old ways must be respected. I raised my camera, making sure the flash was off. Through my viewfinder, I could see better. About 5 or 6 people in dark clothes, moving old farming tools into the barn. But these weren't normal tools. Even in the dim light, I could see they were covered in those strange symbols, like the one I'd spotted in the office. Click. I took the picture. That's when I saw it, a dark stain on the ground leading into the barn. In the moonlight, it looked black, but I knew what it was. Blood. My heart started pounding, so hard I was sure they could hear it. I backed away slowly, trying to be quiet, but my foot hit an empty can. The sound seemed as loud as a gunshot in the quiet night. "Someone's there," a voice called out. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just ran as fast as I could back to my room. Once inside, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it for good measure. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my camera. For what felt like hours, I sat in the dark, listening. Footsteps passed by my door several times, slow and deliberate. Around 3 a.m., I heard the chanting again, louder this time, coming from somewhere below me. When dawn finally came, I checked the photos I'd taken. But something was wrong. Most of them were too dark to make out anything clearly, except for one. It showed the barn door, and carved into it was a symbol I recognized from my research into farming communities. An ancient harvest mark, but twisted somehow, made sinister. At breakfast, everything seemed normal. Mrs. Blackwood served coffee and eggs like nothing had happened. But Thomas Walsh's seat was empty, and when I asked about him, she just smiled that empty smile. "Oh, he checked out early," she said. "Some salesmen do that. Here one day, gone the next, but his car was still in the parking lot. I could see it through the window. I need to get help," I thought. I need to call the police. I walked to the payphone near the office, dropped in my nickel, and dialed the local sheriff's number I'd seen posted. As the phone rang, I noticed something else. A small door in the ground near the motel's foundation, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. It looked like a storm cellar, but something about it made my skin crawl. "Sheriff's office," a gruff voice answered. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, I heard Mrs. Blackwood's voice behind me. "Breakfast is getting cold, Miss Reed," she said. And in her hand was my camera. My heart stopped when I saw my camera in Mrs. Blackwood's hands. She turned it over slowly, like she was studying it. "Interesting pictures you've been taking, Miss Reed," she said, her voice soft but scary. "We should talk about them." I followed her back to the office, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. Every step felt wrong, but what choice did I have? She had my camera, my livelihood, my evidence. The office looked different in the morning light. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before, a wall of photos behind the desk. They looked like pictures of past guests, but something about their faces made my stomach turn. They all had the same empty look in their eyes. Mrs. Blackwood sat behind her desk and placed my camera between us. "You're not just here to photograph harvest festivals, are you?" she asked. "My car broke down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's all." She smiled the empty smile again. "You know what's special about harvest time, Miss Reed? It's when we separate what we want to keep from what we need to cut away." A knock at the office door made us both jump. It was the sheriff, the same one I'd tried to call earlier. He was a big man with a weather-beaten face and a star on his chest that caught the morning light. "Everything all right here, Martha?" he asked Mrs. Blackwood, but his eyes were on me. "Just fine, Sheriff Porter," she said. "Miss Reed here is quite the photographer." The way they looked at each other told me everything I needed to know. The sheriff wasn't here to help me. He was part of whatever was happening. "I'd like to see your pictures," Sheriff Porter said, reaching for my camera. That's when I did something either very brave or very stupid. I grabbed my camera and ran. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran straight to that cellar door I'd seen earlier. If they were hiding something, it would be down there. The lock was old and rusty, and with one hard pull, it broke open. The stairs led down into darkness. I could hear footsteps getting closer above me. This is crazy, I thought, but going back might be crazier. I went down the stairs, using my camera's flash to light the way. The basement was bigger than I expected, more like a tunnel system. The walls were dirt and stone, held up by old wooden beams. And everywhere, there were those strange symbols carved into the walls. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Someone crying deeper in the tunnels. "Hello," I whispered. "Mr. Walsh? Is that you?" The crying stopped, replaced by a shuffling sound. My camera flash showed me something that made me gasp. A wall of photographs, hundreds of them. Missing person posters, newspaper clippings, all dating back to the 1920s. And they all had one thing in common. The people had disappeared during harvest season. But that wasn't the worst part. I noticed something else about the missing people in the photos. Most of them were women, and according to the descriptions, they were all expecting mothers. Just like me. I hadn't told anyone yet. I was only 2 months along. I'd been planning to finish this assignment before heading home to tell my family. But somehow they knew. The sound of footsteps on the cellar stairs made me jump. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "Miss Reed?" Sheriff Porter's voice echoed off the walls. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The harvest moon is coming, and the old ways must be respected." I backed deeper into the tunnel, one hand on my camera, the other protectively over my stomach. The crying sound started again, closer now. I turned a corner, and my camera flash lit up something that made me scream. There was Thomas Walsh, tied to one of the wooden support beams. His bow tie was gone, and his shirt was stained dark. He looked up at me with terrified eyes. "Run," he whispered. "They're not just people. There's something else. Something old. Something hungry." I had to make a choice, run away or help Thomas Walsh. The footsteps were getting closer, flashlight beams dancing on the tunnel walls. "Please," Thomas whispered. "Don't leave me here." My hands shook as I worked on the ropes that held him. They were tied tight, but my dad had taught me how to undo knots back when we used to go fishing. "Focus, Eleanor," I told myself, just like untying a boat from the dock. That's when I heard Mrs. Blackwood's voice, closer now. "The baby will make the harvest stronger this year, the strongest in decades." My fingers moved faster. One rope came loose, then another. Thomas was so weak he could barely stand, but we had to move. "This way," he said, pointing deeper into the tunnels. I heard them talking. "There's a way out through the old grain storage." We stumbled through the darkness, using my camera flash to light the way. The tunnels were like a maze, and the walls were covered with more of those strange symbols. Some looked fresh, carved recently into the dirt walls. "What do they want?" I whispered as we moved. "They believe in the old ways," Thomas said, his voice weak. "They think sacrificing people, especially expecting mothers, brings better harvests. They've been doing it for generations." A sound up ahead made us freeze. Chanting, like what I'd heard before, but clearer now. And underneath it, something else. A sound like dry corn stalks rustling in the wind, but we were underground. We turned a corner, and my camera flash showed something that made my heart stop. A large round room, like a basement sanctuary. The walls were lined with those old farming tools, scythes, sickles, and things I didn't recognize, all covered in symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light. But it was what was in the center that made me want to scream. A circle of people in old-fashioned farming clothes, wearing masks made from dried corn husks. They were swaying and chanting, surrounding something that looked like an altar made of old wood and iron. "The grain storage," Thomas pointed with a shaking hand. "The exit's on the other side of that room." We backed away slowly, looking for another way around. That's when my camera flash caught something else. Other tunnels leading to other motels, other towns. This wasn't just about the Harvest Moon Motel. This was bigger. Click. My camera went off by accident. The chanting stopped. "She's here." Mrs. Blackwood's voice echoed through the tunnels. "Find her." We ran. There was no other choice now. Thomas was slow, hurt, but he tried to keep up. Behind us, I could hear them. Coming footsteps and that awful rustling sound. We made it to another tunnel when Thomas stumbled. "Go," he said. "I'll slow them down. Get to the sheriff in the next county. Show them your pictures." "I can't leave you," I said, but he pushed me away. "You're not just saving yourself," he reminded me. My hand went to my stomach. He was right. I heard him yell as I ran, trying to distract them. I wanted to go back, but I kept running, using my camera flash to light the way. That's when I saw it. Moonlight coming through cracks in a wooden ceiling. The grain storage. I was almost out, but as I reached the old ladder leading up, a hand grabbed my ankle. "The harvest must be fed," Mrs. Blackwood said. In the camera flash, her face looked different, older somehow, like she'd aged 100 years in one night. Behind her, the others were coming, their corn husk masks grinning in the darkness. And they were carrying their tools at Mrs. Blackwood's hand was like ice around my ankle. I kicked hard and my shoe came off, but I broke free. The ladder creaked as I climbed, my camera bouncing against my chest. "You don't understand," Mrs. Blackwood called up. "The land demands sacrifice. Without it, the crops die. The people starve. We do this for everyone." I reached the top of the ladder and pushed against the wooden trapdoor. It was heavy, but fear made me stronger. As it opened, cool night air hit my face. I was in an old grain storage building, just like Thomas had said. The harvest moon shone through holes in the roof, painting everything blood red. My heart was beating so fast I could barely think. Behind me, I heard them coming up the ladder. "Think, Eleanor. Think." That's when I remembered something from my childhood on the farm. Old grain dust in the air. It could catch fire easily. Papa had always warned us about it. And these cultists with their candles and rituals. I had an idea, a dangerous one. I waited until they were almost at the top of the ladder. Mrs. Blackwood came first, then Sheriff Porter, then the others in their corn husk masks. They spread out around me, holding their twisted farming tools. "No more running," Sheriff Porter said. "The harvest moon is highest now. It's time." I raised my camera. They flinched. They hated having their pictures taken. But that's not what I was doing. "You're right," I said. "No more running." I aimed at the candle one of them was holding and pressed the flash button repeatedly. In the dark room, each flash was like lightning. But more importantly, each flash sent clouds of old grain dust swirling in the air. One spark. That's all it would take. "Stop that," Mrs. Blackwood screamed, but I kept going. Flash, flash, flash. The dust sparkled in the air, and then whoosh. The flame from their candle caught the dust, and suddenly the air itself was on fire. The cultists screamed as the fire spread faster than anyone could run. Their corn husk masks caught quickly, and the dry wooden walls began to burn. I ran for the door, covering my mouth against the smoke. Behind me, I heard crashes as burning cultists fell through the weakened floor, back into their tunnels. Mrs. Blackwood's voice rose above the chaos, cursing me, but her words were cut off by the roar of the flames. Outside, the night air had never tasted so sweet. I ran until my legs gave out, then looked back to see the old grain storage building burning against the harvest moon. In the distance, I heard fire trucks coming. I didn't stop running until I reached the next town. The sheriff there, a young woman named Sarah Mills, listened to my story and looked at my photographs. Real help finally came. FBI agents, state police reporters. They found Thomas's body in the tunnels. He died trying to help me escape. They found other bodies too, decades of victims buried under those farms. But many of the cultists escaped through their tunnel network, including Mrs. Blackwood. Sometimes at night, I still dream about those tunnels, about the corn husk masks and the twisted tools. The FBI says they found similar cases across the Midwest, other motels, other harvest rituals. They're still investigating. My baby was born the following spring, a healthy little girl. I named her Hope. I keep taking pictures, telling stories that need to be told. But I'm more careful now about where I stop for the night. And every harvest season, when the moon grows full, I make sure all my doors are locked. Because somewhere out there, in the endless fields of the Midwest, the old ways are still being followed. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear chanting on the wind. I'm writing this from my small apartment in Chicago, where I live now with my daughter Hope. She's 6 months old and has her father's eyes. I still work as a photographer, but I'm picky about my assignments these days. Last week, I got a letter. No return address. Just a blank piece of paper with one of those harvest symbols drawn on it. I should have thrown it away, but instead, I added it to my growing file of evidence. You see, I've been keeping track of similar cases. Every few months, I hear about another missing person somewhere in farm country, always during harvest season, always near small motels or roadside stops. The police say they're not connected, but I know better. Yesterday, I got a call from Sheriff Mills. They found another tunnel system under a motel in Iowa. Same symbols on the walls, same old tools, but no Mrs. Blackwood, no cultists. They'd moved on, like they always do. I keep my camera ready, not just for my work, but because sometimes it's the only way to prove what's real. My photos from that night at the Harvest Moon Motel are locked in a safe deposit box. Most of them came out dark or blurry, but a few are clear enough. Clear enough to show what's really happening in those quiet farming towns when the harvest moon rises. Hope is crying now. She needs her bottle. As I walk to her room, I glance out the window. The moon is getting fuller. Harvest season is coming again, but this time I'm ready. Because now I know the truth. Monsters are real. They don't hide under beds or in closets. They hide in plain sight, in small towns and quiet motels, keeping to the old ways. And somewhere out there, Mrs. Blackwood is still alive, still watching, still waiting for the next harvest moon. I know because last night, driving home from an assignment, I passed a new motel just outside the city. And there, behind the front desk, I saw a familiar face. By the time I turned around, she was gone, but the sign above the motel caught my eye. Harvest Moon Inn under new management. Keep driving, I told myself. Just keep driving. And I did, but I also took a picture, just in case. My name is Marcus Powell, and I've been a detective for 15 years. I thought I'd seen everything until I got the case at Echo Lake Lodge. That place changed me forever. It all started on a cold January morning in 1977. The kind of morning where your breath freezes in front of your face and the snow crunches under your boots like broken glass. I was sitting at my desk, drinking coffee that had already gone cold, when Chief Rogers dropped a thick file on my desk. 7 people, Powell, he said, his face grim. 7 people have vanished from that lodge in the last 30 years. And now we've got another missing person report. I opened the file and stared at the photos. Echo Lake Lodge stood tall and proud against a backdrop of pine trees, looking like something from a fancy vacation magazine. But there was something off about it. Maybe it was the way the windows seemed to stare back at me like dark, empty eyes. Something's not right about this place, I thought as I flipped through the pages. Each missing person had stayed in room 237. That couldn't be a coincidence. The latest disappearance was Linda Chun, a college student who'd gone up to the lodge for a weekend getaway. Her roommate reported her missing 3 days ago when she didn't come back to campus. The Hamilton family owns it, Chief Rogers continued. Old money, lots of influence. They're pressing us to solve this quietly. I nodded, but my gut was already telling me there wouldn't be anything quiet about this case. Asterisk, why always room 237? What's really going on up there? Asterisk, I gathered my things and headed out to my car. The drive to Echo Lake Lodge would take about 2 hours, deep into the Minnesota wilderness. As I drove, I kept thinking about those missing people. 7 souls who walked into that lodge and never walked out. The roads got narrower and the trees got thicker as I drove. My radio started acting funny, playing static and bits of old songs. Then it died completely. Great, I thought. Just what I need. When I finally saw the lodge, it took my breath away. 3 stories of dark wood and stone, with a roof dusted in snow like powdered sugar. The frozen lake behind it stretched out forever, a sheet of white under the gray sky. A sign creaked in the wind, Echo Lake Lodge, EST 1943. But something made me stop before I got out of my car. Maybe it was the way no smoke came from any of the chimneys, even though the parking lot had a few cars. Maybe it was how still everything was. No birds, no small animals, just silence. Detective Powell? A woman's voice made me jump. I hadn't heard anyone approach. She was tall, elegant, wearing a black wool coat. I'm Margaret Hamilton. We've been expecting you. We've been expecting you. The word sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. As I followed Mrs. Hamilton up the steps of the lodge, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching me, waiting for me. I had no idea then that I was walking into the most terrifying case of my life. No idea that Echo Lake Lodge would make me question everything I believed about reality. No idea that by the time this was over, I'd learned some doors should stay closed, some secrets should stay buried, and some waters should never be disturbed. But I was about to find out. Margaret Hamilton led me into the lodge's main hall. The floor was dark wood that creaked under our feet, and old pictures lined the walls. Everything smelled like pine and dust. Room 237 is upstairs, she said quietly. No one stayed there since Miss Chun disappeared. I looked around, taking notes in my little book. The place was fancy, but something felt wrong. Like when you walk into a room and know someone's been there, even though nothing's moved. Mrs. Hamilton, I said, can you tell me about the lodge's history? She sat down in a big leather chair, her hands folded in her lap. My grandfather built this lodge in 1943. The original building burned down that same year. She paused. There were stories about the first lodge. What kind of stories? The kind locals tell around campfires, detective. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. About the massacre that happened here in the 1800s. The tribal people who lived here fought against settlers. Many died on both sides. Why do I feel like she's not telling me everything? I wondered. I spent the next few hours talking to the staff. Old Joe, the maintenance man, had worked here for 40 years. His hands shook as he told me about the things he'd found in the lake. Every spring when the ice melts, he whispered, the lake gives up its secrets. Old arrows, pieces of pottery. Once found a rifle from the 1800s. He looked around like he was afraid someone might hear. The local tribes won't come here anymore. Say the water spirits are angry. I went down to the lake's edge. The ice was thick and gray, stretching out like glass. My reflection looked back at me, but for a second, just a second, I thought I saw something else in the ice, a face that wasn't mine. Back inside, I found the lodge's old records in a dusty office. 7 missing people over 30 years, all from room 237, all during winter. I started making a timeline on a blank page. 1947, Thomas Reed. Businessman, 1953, Mary Collins. Teacher, 1959, James Wright. Doctor, 1965. Sarah Martinez. Artist, 1971, David Kim. Student, 1975, Robert Foster. Writer, 1977. Linda Chun. Student as I wrote. The temperature seemed to drop. I could see my breath in the air. Even though the heating was on, the light from my desk lamp flickered. Something's watching me, I thought. But when I turned around, the office was empty. I found more old newspapers in a box under the desk. The 1943 fire wasn't the first strange thing to happen here. Previous owners reported seeing things. People who weren't there. Furniture moving on its own. 3 different families had owned the lodge before the Hamiltons bought it. None had stayed longer than a year. The sun was setting when Margaret Hamilton found me again. You should stay the night, detective, she said. The roads get dangerous after dark. I wanted to say no. Everything in me was screaming to get in my car and drive away. But I needed to solve this case. Those 7 missing people deserved answers. I'll stay, I said, but not in room 237. She smiled that empty smile again. Of course not. We'll put you in room 241, just down the hall. As I followed her upstairs, I didn't know that being close to room 237 was exactly what something in this lodge wanted. And that night, I would start to understand why some places keep their secrets buried deep, because digging them up can cost more than just your life. The real question wasn't why 7 people had disappeared from room 237. The real question was, why did the lodge want me to find out? Room 241 was nice enough, with a big bed and windows looking out over the frozen lake. But I couldn't sleep. The walls seemed to creak every few minutes, even when the wind wasn't blowing. Around midnight, I got up and took my flashlight. Time to do some real detective work, I thought. The hallway was dark and quiet. Too quiet. You know how old buildings usually make some noise? Pipes knocking with settling? This was different. This was the kind of quiet that feels like someone holding their breath. I walked slowly toward room 237. The carpet muffled my footsteps, but each step felt heavy, like the air itself was getting thicker. When I reached the door, my hands were sweating despite the cold. The key I borrowed from old Joe's office worked. Inside, room 237 looked normal at first. Just another hotel room with a bed, desk, and chairs. But then I noticed something odd about the wallpaper near the bathroom. I ran my fingers along the wall and felt a slight breeze. There shouldn't be any breeze in here. I pressed harder and part of the wall moved. Behind the wallpaper was a door, a small one, like for a storage closet. My heart was pounding as I peeled back the wallpaper. The hidden door was made of old wood, with strange marks carved into it. They looked like waves or maybe snakes. Before I could open it, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I quickly closed room 237's door and ducked around the corner. The footsteps went right past me, but when I looked, there was nobody there. Keep it together, Powell, I told myself. There has to be a normal explanation. The next morning, I went up to the attic to look for more clues. The stairs were steep and dust covered everything. But in the corner, something caught my eye, a pile of suitcases. My hands shook as I opened them. Inside the first one were clothes and a diary belonging to Thomas Reed, the businessman who disappeared in 1947. The second had Mary Collins' teaching papers from 1953. Each suitcase belonged to one of the missing people. Finding everything you need, detective. I jumped. Margaret Hamilton stood at the top of the stairs. I hadn't heard her come up. Care to explain why you have the missing guest belongings up here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Those old things? We keep them in case someone comes looking. She smiled. No one ever does. Just then, we heard a scream from downstairs. We ran down to find one of the maids, Betty, standing in the hallway, shaking. The mirrors, she whispered. I was cleaning room 237, and the mirrors, they showed something else. People I didn't know. They were trying to talk to me. I helped Betty to a chair, while Mrs. Hamilton got her some water. But when I went to check room 237, the mirrors were normal. Just my own reflection staring back at me. That afternoon, things got worse. Old Joe went missing. We found his tool belt in the basement, next to some more strange carvings on the floor. They matched the ones on the hidden door. I called the station for backup, but the phones weren't working. When I tried to leave to get help, my car wouldn't start. None of the cars in the parking lot would. We're trapped here, I realized, and something wants us to stay. As the sun set, I heard children laughing somewhere in the lodge. But there weren't any children staying here. Hadn't been any all winter, according to the guest book. I went back to my room and locked the door, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was happening in Echo Lake Lodge was just getting started. The missing people, the hidden door, the carvings, the suitcases, they were all pieces of a puzzle. And with each piece I found, I felt less sure I wanted to see the whole picture. Because now I knew the lodge wasn't just haunted. It was hungry. And somehow, I knew I was next on its menu. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the sound of running water. The bathroom tap was on full blast, but the water, it wasn't right. It was black as ink, and it smelled like the bottom of a lake. I tried to turn it off, but the handle wouldn't move. The water kept flowing, and in its dark surface, I saw things, flashes of other times, other people. A woman in old-fashioned clothes screaming. Children running down hallways that looked newer than they should. A man in a suit backing away from something I couldn't see. Then the tap shut off by itself. Get a grip, I told myself. There has to be a reasonable explanation. But the part of me that had been a detective for 15 years knew better. Sometimes the reasonable explanation isn't the right one. I checked my watch. Midnight exactly. I remember what Betty, the maid, had said about the mirrors in room 237. Making a decision I knew I'd probably regret, I grabbed my flashlight and went back there. The room was freezing, much colder than the hallway. My breath came out in white clouds, and the beam of my flashlight seemed weaker than it should be. I walked to the bathroom mirror and waited. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, my reflection changed. It wasn't me anymore. It was Linda Chun, the missing college student. She was trying to say something, but I couldn't hear her. Behind her, I saw others. All the missing people, their faces scared and confused. They were pointing at something, the hidden door I'd found earlier. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even more. Ice crystals formed on the mirror, making patterns like the carvings I'd seen. The patterns spread across the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere. I heard children laughing again, closer this time. The sound seemed to move in a pattern through the lodge, down the hall, up the stairs, across the ceiling. always getting closer. Then I saw them, not in the mirror, but reflected in the ice on the walls. 3 children in old-fashioned clothes, playing some kind of game. They were running from something. The lights started flickering, and with each flicker, the room seemed to change. One moment it was normal. The next it looked old and burned, then new again, then something else entirely. This isn't possible, I thought. But I'd stopped believing impossible the moment I stepped into Echo Lake Lodge. Objects in the room began to move. The chair slid across the floor by itself. Books flew off shelves. The bed lifted a few inches off the ground. And through it all, I could hear something coming from the lake. A deep sound, like a drum beating under the ice. I ran back to my room and grabbed my case files. There had to be something I had missed, some connection between all of this. As I spread the papers on my bed, I noticed something strange. The temperature wasn't dropping randomly. It was making a pattern. I drew it out on a piece of paper, a spiral, starting from room 237 and moving outward through the whole lodge. The same pattern was in the old newspapers, in the carvings, in the ice crystals on the mirror. Then I remembered something else. The suitcases in the attic hadn't been dusty like everything else. Someone had been moving them recently. The Hamiltons know more than they're telling me, I thought. They know what this place really is. A knock at my door made me jump. Detective Powell? It was Margaret Hamilton. We need to talk. It's about your partner. My partner? I said, what are you talking about? I came here alone. Did you? She asked. And when I opened the door, what I saw made my blood run cold. Because she was right. I hadn't come here alone. I'd just forgotten who I'd come with. And now I was starting to remember why the MY had started hurting as memories came flooding back. Agent Sarah Miller, my partner for the last 3 years. We'd driven up to Echo Lake Lodge together, but somehow I'd forgotten she was ever here. Where is she? I demanded, my voice shaking. Margaret Hamilton's face showed no emotion. Room 237 took her, just like the others. Just like it almost took you the first time. First time? The pain in my head got worse. What are you talking about? You were here before, Detective Powell. 20 years ago. You were just a boy then. She pulled an old photo from her pocket and handed it to me. My hands trembled as I looked at it. A family photo from 1957. A mom, dad, and a 10-year-old boy standing in front of Echo Lake Lodge. The boy was me. No, I whispered. That's impossible. I've never been here before. But even as I said it, memories started breaking through like cracks in ice. My parents bringing me here for a weekend trip. Dad going to room 237 to get something and never coming back. Mom running into the room to find him. Me, standing in the hallway, watching both of them disappear. The lodge let you go that time, Margaret said softly. It doesn't usually do that. Maybe it was waiting for you to come back. I sat down hard in a chair, my legs too weak to hold me up. Sarah? She figured it out, didn't she? That's why the lodge took her. Margaret nodded. She found the old guest records. Realized your parents were among the missing. When she tried to tell you, she gestured at the lodge around us. This place has ways of making people forget what it doesn't want them to remember. I jumped up and ran to room 237, ignoring Margaret calling after me. The hidden door was still there behind the wallpaper. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the edge and pulled it open. Behind it was a narrow passage that seemed to go down into the ground. The walls were covered in those same wave-like carvings, and they seemed to move in my flashlight beam. Detective, wait. Margaret caught up to me. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just a haunted building. The lodge is just a door, a way for something much older to reach our world. I don't care what it is, I said. It took my parents. It took Sarah. And now it's going to give them back. But Margaret grabbed my arm. Look at your watch, she said. I did. The hands were spinning backward, and as they moved, I saw the passage changing. One moment it was wood, then stone, then earth, then something else entirely. Time wasn't working right here. Your parents came here because of your grandmother, Margaret said. She was one of the original settlers. One of the ones who made a deal with the water spirit in the lake. Eternal life. In exchange for regular sacrifices. I remembered something else then. My grandmother's face in an old picture, looking exactly the same in photos taken 30 years apart. I'd always thought they were different women in the family who looked alike. The deal went bad, Margaret continued. The spirit got greedy. Started taking more than what was promised. That's when your grandmother tried to burn the lodge down in 1943. But you can't burn water. I looked at her sharply. How do you know all this? She smiled sadly. Because Margaret Hamilton died in 1943. I'm just wearing her face. The lodge needs someone to bring it new guests, you see. Before I could react, I heard Sarah's voice calling from deep in the passage, Marcus, help me. I knew it was probably a trap. Knew I should run. But I also knew I couldn't leave her down there. Couldn't leave any of them down there. I'm going in, I said. Then you should know one more thing, Margaret, or whatever she was said. Time moves differently in there. What feels like minutes might be years up here. And the only way to free someone, she paused, is to take their place. I took a deep breath and stepped into the passage. Behind me, I heard the door close. There was no going back now. Only down the passage went down forever. My flashlight showed smooth walls that changed as I walked. Sometimes wood, sometimes stone, sometimes looking like they were made of water frozen in place. The carvings moved like waves in my light, making me dizzy if I looked at them too long. Sarah, I called out. Can you hear me? Her voice came back, but from everywhere at once. Marcus, be careful. Time isn't right down here. I kept going deeper. The air got colder and wetter. Then I stepped into a huge room that shouldn't have been possible under the lodge. It was like a cave, but the walls were made of dark ice. In that ice, I could see faces, so many faces, all the missing people. And there, frozen right in front of me, were my parents. They looked exactly like they had 20 years ago, trapped in mid-motion, reaching for each other. Mom? Dad? My voice cracked. I touched the ice, and suddenly I was seeing their last moments. Dad opening the door to room 237, seeing the passage. Mom running after him, both of them ending up here, facing the thing that lived in the lake. Beautiful, aren't they? I spun around. A woman stood there, but she wasn't really a woman. She looked like she was made of black water, in the shape of a person. Her eyes were deep and dark, like the bottom of Echo Lake. Where's Sarah? I demanded. The water woman waved her hand, and part of the ice wall became clear. Sarah was there, still moving, still alive, but slowly being covered by ice. She's joining my collection, the water woman said. Just like your parents. Just like all the others who came looking for them. Let them go, I said, trying to sound brave. She laughed, and it sounded like ice cracking. Why should I? They're mine now. Your grandmother promised me sacrifices in exchange for eternal life. When she tried to break our deal, I took matters into my own hands. As she spoke, I saw movement in the ice behind her. The faces of children, the same ones I'd seen in the reflections upstairs. They were trying to tell me something. Then I remembered what Margaret had said. The only way to free someone is to take their place. I looked at my parents, at Sarah slowly freezing, at all the other trapped people, and I made a choice. What if I made you a different deal? I said, let them all go, and you can have me instead. One sacrifice willingly given has to be worth more than one's taken by force. The water woman moved closer, interested. You would do that? Give up your life for theirs? Yes, I said, but I have conditions. Everyone goes free, not just Sarah and my parents, but everyone you've taken. and the lodge has to be destroyed. No more victims. She circled me, thinking, "You are brave, Detective Powell. And you're right. A willing sacrifice is powerful. But why should I give up my lovely lodge?" I smiled. "Because you're hungry. I can see it. The lodge doesn't bring you enough victims anymore. People have started to suspect. But if you let them go, if you take me and end this, your story becomes a legend. The brave detective who went missing in the mysterious lodge that burned down. People will tell that story forever." The water woman stopped moving. I could tell she liked that idea. Legends had power too. "Very well," she said. "A deal freely made." She held out her hand, dripping dark water. I took it. Everything happened at once. The ice walls cracked open. People started falling out. My parents, Sarah, Linda Chun, all of them. They were confused, dazed, but alive. Sarah tried to grab me, but her hand went right through mine. "Marcus, no," she screamed. "It's okay," I said, already feeling the cold creeping up my legs. "Get them out." And Sarah, burn it all down. The last thing I saw was Sarah dragging my parents and the others up the passage. Then the ice took me. I don't know how long I've been here. Time works differently in the dark water under Echo Lake. Sometimes I see things in the ice. Sarah setting the lodge on fire. My parents being reunited with a family that had thought them long dead. The other victims going home. The water woman kept her word. The lodge is gone, and she took only what was freely given. Sometimes I think I see other things too. Glimpses of other places where dark water holds secrets. Other buildings that aren't quite right. But those are stories for another time. For now, I'm here in the dark and the quiet, in the cold embrace of Echo Lake. A willing sacrifice, yes, but also a guardian, making sure some doors stay closed, some water stay still, and some secrets stay buried. After all, that's what detectives do. We protect people, even if they never know from what, even if it takes forever. My name is Rachel Bennett, and I used to be a psychiatrist. Used to be. Funny how those 3 words can carry so much weight. But I should start at the beginning. Back when I still believed in science and reason, before Pine Grove Sanitarium changed everything I thought I knew about the human mind. It was a cold October morning when I first drove up that winding mountain road. The falling leaves looked like drops of blood against the gray sky. At least that's how I remember it now. Maybe I'm just coloring my memories with what came later. My old Toyota struggled up the steep path, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the trees grew thicker around me. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, but the wrought iron gates ahead told me I'd found the right place. Pine Grove Sanitarium, established 1924. "You must be Dr. Bennett," called a voice as I stepped out of my car. A short nun with kind eyes and worry lines around her mouth hurried down the front steps. "I'm Sister Margaret. We've been waiting for you." I tried to smile, but something about the way she said waiting made my stomach twist. "Yes, that's me. I'm excited to start work here." That wasn't entirely true. I was desperate. After the incident at my last hospital in Denver, no place would hire me except this remote facility that hadn't updated its practices since the 1950s. Sister Margaret led me through heavy wooden doors into a lobby that smelled of pine cleaner and something else, something metallic that reminded me of old pennies. "We have 43 patients currently," she explained as we walked. "Most have been with us for years. They need special care." The corridors were long and dim, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps. Our footsteps echoed on the tile floors, and I could hear distant sounds, crying, laughing, screaming. It was hard to tell. "Your office is here," Sister Margaret said, stopping at a door with clouded glass. Dr. Monroe left rather suddenly. His files should still be in order. "Left suddenly?" I asked. "The board didn't mention Dash," but Sister Margaret was already walking away, her shoes clicking on the tile. "Dinner is at 6 in the staff dining room," she called over her shoulder. "Oh, and Dr. Bennett? Stay out of the basement, for your own safety." I stood there watching her disappear around a corner, wondering if I'd imagined that last part. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a cluttered office with wood paneling and a desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. A stack of patient files sat in the center, topped by a note written in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, they're all connected. Patient 214 knows the truth. God forgive me for what we've done. Asterisk, I picked up the top file and opened it. A paper slipped out and floated to the floor. An old black and white photograph. It showed a group of doctors standing in front of the sanitarium. But what caught my eye was a date scrawled on the back, 1938. And there, in the center of the group, was a face I recognized. I'd just seen that exact same face an hour ago on one of the patients in Ward C. The fluorescent light above me buzzed and went out, plunging the office into shadow. Somewhere down the hall, someone started screaming. I hadn't known it then, but that was the moment my real education in madness began. The screaming stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited in the dark office, counting my breaths until my heart stopped racing. The light flickered back on with a buzz, and I grabbed the old photograph, tucking it into my pocket. I needed to find out more about this place. The next morning, I started my rounds. Ward A was for the violent patients, the ones who couldn't control their actions. The nurses called them the angry ones. Their rooms had thick metal doors with small windows, and I could feel eyes watching me as I walked past. Ward B was quieter, too quiet. The catatonic patients sat in their wheelchairs or lay in their beds, staring at nothing. They've been like this for years, Nurse Jin told me. We feed them, clean them, turn them so they don't get bed sores. Sometimes they make sounds, but never words. But it was Ward C that really bothered me. These were the experimental treatment patients. Their rooms had strange machines I'd never seen before, metal boxes with dials and wires, humming softly. The patients here could talk, but what they said made my skin crawl. "The doctors come at night," one woman whispered to me. "They open our heads and put things inside, things that whisper to us." I tried to tell myself she was just confused, delusional. But then I found the surgery records, hundreds of operations that weren't in the official files. And the equipment. It wasn't like any medical device I'd ever studied. That's when I met patient 214. He was an old man with bright, clear eyes that didn't match his wrinkled face. He sat in a corner of the common room, playing chess by himself. "Dr. Bennett," he said as I walked past. I hadn't told him my name. "Have you found Ward D yet?" I stopped. "There is no Ward D." He smiled, showing teeth that looked too white, too perfect. "That's what they want you to think. Just like they want you to think I'm crazy." He leaned forward. "I built this place, you know, back in 1924. Or at least, the man in that photograph in your pocket did." My hand went to where I'd hidden the photo. "That's impossible. You'd have to be over 100 years old." "Impossible?" He laughed. "In Pine Grove, impossible is just the beginning. Ask yourself, why do the catatonic patients all blink at the same time? Why do the lights always flicker at 3:33? What's behind the wall in the old operating theater that sounds like a heartbeat?" A nurse came to give him his medication before I could ask more questions. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what he'd said about Ward D. So I did something stupid. I went looking for it. I waited until the night shift changed at 2 a.m. The hallways were darker at night, and my footsteps seemed louder. I followed the old pipes along the ceiling. They had to lead somewhere, and that's when I found it. A door hidden behind a supply cabinet in the basement. It wasn't locked. I should have waited, should have come back in daylight with help. But I opened it anyway. The smell hit me first, antiseptic, and something else, something rotten. My flashlight beam showed a long corridor stretching into darkness, and on the walls, hundreds of photographs, the same faces over and over, never aging. Some dated back to 1924. Behind me, the door slammed shut, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, I heard footsteps coming closer. My hands shook as I pointed the flashlight down the corridor. The footsteps stopped. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I should have run, but I had to know. The beam of light showed me more photographs on the walls, and below them, filing cabinets. Dozens of them. I pulled one open, and the metal squeaked in the darkness. Inside were patient files, but not like any I'd seen before. These were different, older, handwritten in German. My hands froze when I saw the symbol at the top of each page, a Nazi swastika. The footsteps started again, closer now. I spun around, and my flashlight caught a face in the darkness. It was Nurse Chun, but something was wrong with her eyes. They were completely black. "You shouldn't be here, Dr. Bennett," she said, but her voice wasn't her own. It was deeper, older, like many voices speaking at once. Some doors are meant to stay closed. I ran. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I raced back toward the entrance. But when I reached it, the door wouldn't open. Behind me, Nurse Chun was walking slowly, so slowly, like she had all the time in the world. "The experiments must continue," she said in that strange voice. "We're so close to the breakthrough. Your predecessor understood that. In the end, my fingers found a light switch, and fluorescent bulbs flickered to life above us. In the harsh light, Nurse Chun blinked, and her eyes were normal again. She looked confused, like she'd just woken up from a deep sleep. "Dr. Bennett, what are we doing down here?" she asked, her voice back to normal. I don't remember coming down here. I helped her back upstairs, but I couldn't forget what I'd seen. That night, I stayed up late in my office, going through the old files I'd found. They told a horrible story. In the 1930s, Nazi scientists had come to Pine Grove, looking for a way to control the human mind. They'd done terrible experiments on the patients. But something had gone wrong in 1938. There had been a fire and most of the patients had disappeared. Or at least, that's what everyone was told. But the files told a different story. The experiments had worked in a way no one expected. The patients hadn't disappeared, they'd changed. Become something else. Something that didn't age, didn't die. As I read, the lights started flickering again. 3:33 a.m., just like patient 214 had said. And then I heard it, a sound coming from behind the walls, like a giant heartbeat, shaking the whole building. I looked up from the files and froze. All the patients from Ward B, the catatonic ones, were standing in the hallway outside my office. Their eyes were open wide, and they were all staring at me, moving together like they shared one mind. And they were smiling. I backed away from my office door, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The patients moved as one, taking a single step forward, then another. Their smiles never changed. "Help!" I screamed. "Somebody help!" The lights went out again. In the darkness, I heard shuffling footsteps, getting closer and closer. When the lights came back on seconds later, the hallway was empty, like they'd never been there at all. Was I losing my mind? The next morning, I asked Sister Margaret about the Nazi scientist. Her face went pale. "Where did you hear about that?" "I found files," I said. "In the basement." She grabbed my arm. Her fingers were ice cold. "Listen to me carefully, Dr. Bennett. There are things in this building that no one can explain. Things that shouldn't be possible. Dr. Monroe found out too much. That's why he..." She stopped talking and stared at something behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, Sister Margaret was walking away quickly, making the sign of the cross. That afternoon, I found the old operating theater. It was hidden behind a fake wall in Ward C, just like patient 214 had said. The room was huge, with seats arranged in a circle like a college classroom. In the center was an operating table, covered in strange symbols I'd never seen before. But it was the sound that made my blood run cold. A deep thumping noise coming from behind the walls, like a massive heart beating. I pressed my ear against the wall and heard something else. Voices chanting in German. I ran back to my office and called the medical board. They needed to know what was happening here. But when I finally got someone on the phone, their response chilled me. Pine Grove Sanitarium? That place burned down in 1938. There's nothing there now but ruins. That's impossible, I said. I'm there right now. I can see dash, thunder crashed outside, making me jump. A storm was coming in, dark clouds rolling over the mountains. And that's when I saw my reflection in the window. My eyes were completely black. I rubbed them hard, and they went back to normal. But now I knew whatever was happening to the others was happening to me too. The whole building seemed to pulse with that strange heartbeat sound. And everywhere I looked, I saw shadows moving where there shouldn't be shadows. Patient 214 was waiting in my office when I turned around. Now you know, he said. We're all part of it now. The experiment never ended. It just evolved. What experiment? I whispered. What's really happening here? He smiled, showing those perfect teeth again. Come with me, he said. It's time you saw what's in the basement. What's really in the basement? Lightning flashed outside, and in that brief light, I saw his face change. Just for a second, but it was enough to make me scream. His face wasn't old anymore. It was young, exactly like in the photograph from 1938. Then the lightning faded, and he was just an old man again, smiling at my terror. The storm's getting worse, he said calmly, like nothing had happened. Soon the power will go out, and then they'll all wake up. As if on cue, the wind howled louder outside, and rain pounded against the windows. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. In the darkness, I heard doors starting to open throughout the building. Emergency lights came on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. And that's when the screaming started. Not from Ward A where the violent patients were kept, but from Ward B. The catatonic patients were all standing up, moving together like dancers in a terrible ballet. What's happening? I asked, but patient 214 was gone. In the hallway, I could hear running footsteps and shouting. Sister Margaret's voice rose above the chaos. They're awake. God help us. They're all awake. I ran to Ward B. The patients who hadn't moved or spoken in years were now walking around, their movements jerky like puppets on strings. Their eyes were all black, just like mine had been in the window, and they were heading for the basement. Nurse Chen appeared beside me, grabbing my arm. Dr. Bennett, we have to stop them. The thing in the basement, it's calling them. That heartbeat sound was louder now, shaking the whole building. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones. And I could hear the chanting again, getting louder and louder. We followed the patients down to the basement. The hidden door was wide open now, leading to that long, dark corridor. But this time, there was light at the end, a sickly green glow coming from somewhere deep underground. The mass grave, Nurse Chen whispered. It's not a grave at all. It's an incubator. We reached the end of the corridor, and I saw it. The wall had cracked open, revealing a massive chamber. Inside were pods, hundreds of them, glowing green, each one containing a body. And they were all opening. The Nazi experiments, I gasped. They weren't trying to control minds. They were trying to copy them, download them into new bodies. Very good, Dr. Bennett, said a voice behind us. I turned to see Sister Margaret, but her face was different now. Younger, harder. We've been waiting almost a century for the right conditions, for enough minds to be connected. And now, thanks to you, we can finally begin the next phase. The chamber's green light pulsed in time with that massive heartbeat. All around us, patients were climbing into empty pods, and in the ones that were opening I could see faces I recognized from those old photographs. They weren't just copying minds. They were bringing back the dead. Thunder crashed overhead, and the building's ancient generators groaned. "Time to choose, Dr. Bennett," Sister Margaret said. "Join us in the new world we're creating, or—" She smiled, and her face flickered between young and old, living and dead. Behind her, I could see patient 214 leading more people down into the chamber. The walls were pulsing now, like a living thing, and that's when the alarm started going off. Red warning lights flashed everywhere as a computerized voice echoed through the speakers. Warning. Containment breach in Sector D, emergency protocols activated. No. Sister Margaret's face twisted in anger. Not now. We're so close. The whole building shook. Above us, pipes began bursting, spraying steam and water. That massive heartbeat sound turned into a painful screech, like metal tearing apart. The backup generators are failing. Nurse Chen shouted over the noise. The whole power grid is overloading. I watched in horror as the green pods started sparking and cracking. The bodies inside were changing, melting, turning into something that wasn't human anymore. Patient 214 grabbed my arm, his face shifting between young and old like a broken TV picture. "You did this," he snarled. "You asked too many questions, dug too deep. Now it's all falling apart." But I hadn't done anything. The facility was destroying itself, like it had a mind of its own, like it was trying to stop what was happening down here. "Everyone out!" Sister Margaret screamed. "Get to the surface." Nobody listened. The patients were still walking into pods, their eyes black and empty. The dead were still climbing out, their faces twisted and wrong. Water was pouring down the walls now, and chunks of ceiling were falling. I ran as fast as I could back up that long corridor, with Nurse Chun right behind me. We could hear explosions below, and the screams. Oh God, the screams. "The doors!" Nurse Chin yelled. "We have to seal the doors." We reached the main basement door, just as more explosions rocked the building. Through the smoke and steam, I could see others running to, or trying to, but something was wrong with them. Their bodies were changing. I slammed the door shut and turned the heavy lock. Nurse Chun and I ran up to the main floor, sealing every door we could find. Behind us, we could hear them coming, pounding on the doors, begging to be let out. "We can't let them reach the surface," Nurse Chun said, her voice shaking. "You understand? They can't get out. Not like that." The building was falling apart around us. Windows shattered as the walls buckled. That horrible heartbeat sound had turned into a death scream that made my ears bleed. We finally reached the main entrance. Through the broken windows, I could see the storm still raging outside. Lightning hit one of the towers, and it crumbled like it was made of sand. "Go," Nurse Chin said, pushing me toward the door. "I'll hold them back. I've been here since 1938. I know what is to be done." Her eyes turned black one last time, but there was kindness in them now. Understanding. She smiled at me, a real, human smile, then pushed me outside and locked the door behind me. I ran through the rain to my car. Behind me, Pine Grove Sanitarium was tearing itself apart. As I drove down the mountain road, I saw the whole building cave in, falling into the earth like it was being swallowed by a giant mouth. The official story said it was a sinkhole caused by the storm. They never found most of the bodies. The few they did find were wrong, changed. They were quickly taken away by men in dark suits who said they were from the government. I try to tell people what really happened. That's why I'm in this new hospital now, where the doctors say I'm sick, where they give me pills to help me forget. But I know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that heartbeat sound again coming from deep underground. And when I look in the mirror at 3:33 a.m., My eyes are still black. I've been in this new hospital for 6 months now. The doctors are kind, but they don't believe me. They say Pine Grove Sanitarium was demolished in 1938. They show me newspaper articles that prove it, but I know what I saw. Yesterday, something strange happened. A new patient arrived, an old woman with kind eyes and worry lines around her mouth. She looked exactly like Sister Margaret, but younger somehow. When she passed my room, she smiled at me. Her teeth were perfect and white. The doctors say no new patient arrived yesterday. They say I imagined it. But this morning, I found something under my pillow, an old photograph, brown with age. It shows a group of doctors standing in front of Pine Grove Sanitarium in 1938. I recognize all their faces now. I see them every day here in the doctors and nurses who take care of me. Their faces don't change anymore, but their eyes are always watching. They think they've won. They think they've silenced me. But I'm writing everything down, hiding these pages where they can't find them. Someone needs to know the truth, because I've seen the blueprints for this hospital. There's a basement here too. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I can hear that heartbeat sound again, getting stronger, getting closer. They're not finished. This isn't over. It's just beginning. My name is Robert Turner, and I've been a private investigator for 15 years. I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, but nothing like what happened at the Whispering Pines Carnival. Even now, months later, I still wake up in cold sweats, hearing that carnival music in my head. It all started on a hot Louisiana morning in June 1988. I was sitting in my office, fans spinning lazily overhead, when Mrs. Richardson walked in. She was wearing expensive clothes that looked like they'd been slept in, and her eyes were red from crying. Her son Tommy had been missing for 2 weeks. The police say he probably ran away, she said, twisting a tissue in her hands. But Tommy wouldn't do that. He was happy, and he's not the only one. There have been other children missing too, all along the carnival's route. That caught my attention. I'd heard whispers about missing kids in the news, but hadn't connected the dots. Mrs. Richardson pulled out newspaper clippings from 3 different states. Each time, children had vanished when the Whispering Pines Carnival was in town. "Something's wrong with that carnival," she whispered. "The way it appears in towns without warning. The way the lights stay on all night, even when they're supposed to be closed. The music that never stops." I took notes as she talked, drawing a timeline. 6 kids gone in 3 months, all between ages 8 and 12. The carnival's path matched perfectly with each disappearance. Could be coincidence, but my gut said otherwise. "I'll need to go undercover," I told her. "Get inside the carnival. See what's really going on." She nodded, pushing an envelope across my desk. "Money's not an issue. Just find our children." 2 days later, I was standing at the carnival's employee entrance, wearing worn jeans and a work shirt, applying for a maintenance job. The manager barely looked at my fake references before hiring me. They were desperate for workers, he said. High turnover rate. Should have been my first warning sign. The carnival looked normal enough in daylight. Faded paint on the rides, smell of popcorn and cotton candy in the air, worn paths between attractions. But something fell off. The layout didn't make sense. Paths that should have been straight curved in weird ways. And the hall of mirrors seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it, like it was breathing. I started work that afternoon, fixing loose bolts on the Ferris wheel. Up high, I could see the whole carnival spread out below. The carousel never seemed to stop, even during breaks. And I swear the horse's eyes followed me as I worked. That night, after the crowds left, I heard children laughing. But when I followed the sound, I only found empty paths and silent rides. As I walked back to my assigned trailer, I passed a fortune teller's tent. The old woman inside caught my eye and smiled. Her teeth were sharp. "Welcome to Whispering Pines," she called out. "You'll find what you're looking for here, whether you want to or not." I locked my trailer door that night, but it didn't help. The carnival music played until dawn, and in my dreams, I saw Tommy Richardson riding the carousel, screaming as the painted horses came alive around him. This was just my first day. I didn't know then that the real horrors were still waiting to be discovered, hidden behind the bright lights and cheerful music of Whispering Pines. My second day at the carnival started early. The sun wasn't up yet, but the carousel music was already playing. I grabbed my toolbox and headed out to check the rides, trying to look like a normal maintenance worker while keeping my eyes open for anything strange. That's when I met Jake, the head mechanic. He was working on the Ferris wheel, using tools I'd never seen before. They didn't look like normal repair tools. They had strange marks carved into them, and some seemed to glow faintly in the early morning light. "Just regular maintenance," he said quickly, hiding the tools when he saw me watching. But I noticed how his hands shook as he put them away. As I worked through the morning, I started noticing patterns. Every ride had the same symbols painted somewhere hidden, under seats, behind panels, or worked into the decorations. They looked like the marks on Jake's tools. I took pictures with the small camera hidden in my watch, trying not to let anyone see. The carnival workers were strange too. The twin acrobats moved exactly the same way, like they were copying each other perfectly. When one spoke, the other's lips moved too. The candy vendor never seemed to eat or drink, but his cart was always full of colorful treats that smelled too sweet. And he was always asking kids to smile, like he was checking their teeth. Around noon, I was fixing a light near the Hall of Mirrors when I heard crying coming from inside. The sign said closed for repairs, but I used my maintenance keys to slip in. The crying got louder, but the sound bounced around so much I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Every mirror showed something different. Sometimes my reflection was older, sometimes younger, sometimes not me at all. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In one mirror, I saw Tommy Richardson. He was banging on the glass, trying to say something, but when I blinked, he was gone. I ran outside, heart pounding. The ringmaster was standing there, watching me with eyes that seemed too old for his face. "Finding everything okay, Mr. Turner?" he asked. I hadn't told anyone my last name. That evening, I called Mrs. Richardson from a payphone in town. "I think I'm getting close," I told her, "but something's very wrong here. The carnival, it's not normal." "Be careful," she whispered. "Last night, I dreamed about Tommy. He was riding that carousel round and round. He couldn't get off. He was screaming for help. I had the same dream the night before, but I didn't tell her that. When I got back to my trailer, I found a candy on my pillow. It hadn't been there before, and my door was still locked. The wrapper had one of those strange symbols on it. I didn't sleep much that night. The carousel music seemed louder than ever, and sometimes I thought I could hear children's voices mixed in with the tune. Tomorrow I decided I would have to look inside that carousel. Something told me that's where the answers would start, if I was brave enough to find them. The next morning, I volunteered to do maintenance on the carousel. Jake looked worried when I offered, but he couldn't say no without seeming suspicious. I waited until the carnival was busy with the lunch crowd, then slipped behind the mechanical panels of the carousel. What I found there still gives me nightmares. The machinery wasn't normal. Instead of gears and motors, there were strange crystals pulsing with dim light. Wrapped around them were what looked like veins, throbbing in time with the music. And carved into every piece of metal were those symbols I'd seen everywhere else. But worst of all were the mirrors placed between the mechanical parts. Each one showed a child's face, frozen in fear. I recognized Tommy Richardson in one of them. His eyes followed me as I moved. When I touched the glass, it was warm like skin. They're not dead, if that's what you're wondering. I spun around. The fortune teller stood there, looking different in the dim light. Her wrinkles seemed deeper, and her eyes glowed faintly like the crystals. "The carousel needs them," she said. Their youth, their energy, their fear. It all feeds the carnival. Keeps us going. Keeps us young. She smiled, showing those sharp teeth again. We tried using adults at first, but they don't work as well. Children believe in magic. That makes them perfect. I wanted to run, but I had to know more. How long? I asked. How long have you been doing this? Oh, since the beginning. 1889. That's when we made the deal. She touched one of the crystals lovingly. The carnival gives us eternal life, and we feed it what it needs. Simple, really. I'm going to stop you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm going to free these children. She laughed. Many have tried. You saw what happened to them in the Hall of Mirrors. But go ahead, try be a hero. The carnival likes heroes. They taste better when they break. I ran back to my trailer and called Mrs. Richardson again. This time, there was no answer. Instead, I heard carousel music playing through the phone. When I looked at my photos from the day before, every picture of the symbols was blurred. But I had one clear shot, a picture I hadn't taken. It showed me sleeping in my trailer last night, while a dark figure stood watching from the corner. That evening, I noticed something else. The carnival's paths had changed again. The carousel was now at the center of everything, and all the paths curved toward it like a spider's web. The music was getting louder, and more children were disappearing into the Hall of Mirrors. The ringmaster announced a special performance planned for tomorrow night. As he spoke, the twin acrobats handed out flyers. The paper felt wet in my hands, and the ink moved like it was alive. Looking closer, I realized the designs were made of tiny screaming faces. I knew I had to act fast. Tomorrow night, whatever dark ritual they were planning would probably trap more children. But now I had proof of what was happening. Even if nobody would ever believe me, I just needed to figure out how to stop it. In my trailer that night, I wrote down everything I discovered. If something happened to me, at least someone would know the truth. Outside, the carousel kept spinning, and I swear I could hear Tommy Richardson calling my name, begging for help. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to do some digging. The carnival's office was dark and quiet, lit only by the colored lights from outside. Using my flashlight and lock-picking skills, I started searching through old files. In a dusty filing cabinet, I found something strange. A leather book that looked hundreds of years old. Its pages were yellow and brittle, but I could still read the handwriting. It was a diary from 1889, belonging to the carnival's first owner, Marcus Pine. My hand shook as I read. Marcus wrote about meeting a voodoo priestess in New Orleans who promised him eternal life and a carnival that would never fail. All he had to do was feed it. At first, they used animals, but the carnival wanted more. That's when the children started disappearing. The diary's last entry gave me chills. The carousel is alive now. I can hear it breathing. The horses aren't wooden anymore, not really. And the mirrors are hungry. God forgive me for what I've started. A noise made me look up. In the office doorway stood Jake, the mechanic. But he looked different, older, much older, like someone trying to look young and not quite managing it. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. You shouldn't know these things. He held up his strange tools. And now I could see they were covered in dried blood. How many? I asked. How many children over the years? Thousands, he whispered. The carnival needs them. We need them. Without regular feedings, we start to age. Fast. And the carnival, it gets angry. He shuddered. You don't want to see it angry. Tomorrow's special performance, I said. It's a feeding, isn't it? Jake nodded. The biggest one yet. The carnival's growing hungry. The normal feedings aren't enough anymore. He looked at me sadly. I'm sorry, but you can't leave now. You know too much. The ringmaster says you have to join us. Or join them. He pointed toward the carousel. I ran. Behind me, Jake called out, but I didn't stop. The carnival paths kept changing, trying to lead me to the carousel, but I fought against it. Finally, I made it back to my trailer. Inside, my phone was ringing. It was Mrs. Richardson again, but her voice was different. Younger, playful, wrong. "Tommy's having so much fun here," she said. "Won't you come play too?" Then the line went dead. Looking out my window, I saw the carnival had changed again. The rides were taller now, more twisted. The Hall of Mirrors had grown to 3 times its size. And the carousel. The horses were moving on their own, their wooden heads turning to watch my trailer. I had just a few hours until the special performance. The sun was coming up, and with it would come crowds of excited families, not knowing they were bringing their children to a feeding. I had to stop it somehow. But first, I needed to understand exactly how this ritual worked. And for that, I had to talk to the fortune teller again whether I wanted to or not. The fortune teller was waiting for me. Her tent was larger now, and the inside looked like a cave filled with strange bottles and crystals like the ones from the carousel. "I wondered when you'd come back," she said. "Ready to make a deal?" "I want to know how to stop it," I said. "How to free the children." She stirred something in a cup that smelled like cotton candy and blood. The carousel runs on belief and fear. The children believe in the magic, you see. Their fear makes it stronger. Break that belief, break the spell. She smiled. But it won't be easy. The carnival will fight back. I noticed her hands were shaking. She looked older than before, like she was having trouble keeping her young appearance. The carnival's getting greedy, isn't it? Taking more than it gives back. Her smile disappeared. It's not fair. We kept our part of the deal for over 100 years. But now, she looked at her wrinkled hands. It wants more and more. Soon there won't be enough children in the world to feed it. That's when I realized not everyone in the carnival was happy with what was happening. Some, like Jake and the fortune teller, were scared of what the carnival was becoming. "Help me," I said. "Help me stop it before it's too late." She handed me a small crystal, just like the ones powering the carousel. "Break this during the performance. It'll disrupt the ritual, maybe long enough to save some of them. But be careful. The ringmaster can't know. He's not even human anymore, hasn't been for years." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I watched families arrive, watched children run laughing toward the rides. Every time I tried to warn someone, my voice wouldn't work. The carnival's magic was getting stronger. At sunset, the ringmaster announced the special performance would begin in 1 hour. Everyone started moving toward the big tent that hadn't been there yesterday. Inside, the seats curved up like a giant spiral, and in the center was a platform with all the missing children. They stood perfectly still, their eyes empty. I spotted Tommy Richardson among them. He looked straight at me, but didn't recognize me. Next to the children, the carousel horses had somehow been moved inside, arranged in a circle. Their eyes glowed red and their wooden teeth looked sharp. The twin acrobats began setting up their equipment, while the candy vendor handed out treats that made people's eyes go glassy. The mechanic Jake stood in a corner, looking sick and ancient. I had the crystal in my pocket and a plan in my head. But as the tent filled with people, I realized something terrible. The carnival wasn't just planning to take the missing children tonight. It wanted every child in the audience too. The ringmaster appeared in the center ring, looking younger and stronger than ever. He raised his hands and the carousel music started playing. But this time, mixed with the music, I could hear screaming. I had one chance to get this right. One chance to save them all. The performance was about to begin, and I could feel the carnival's hunger growing. Whatever I was going to do, I had to do it now. The ringmaster began to speak, his voice hypnotic. Parents sat quietly while their children started walking toward the center ring like they were in a trance. I had to act fast. I pushed through the crowd, pretending to be caught in the spell like everyone else. The fortune teller caught my eye and gave a slight nod. Near the back, I saw Jake starting to cry, his face now wrinkled like ancient paper. Just as I reached the inner circle, the carousel horses began to move. Their wooden bodies cracked and twisted, turning into real flesh and blood. Their eyes blazed red, and their teeth were sharp as knives. The children trapped in the mirrors began screaming. That's when I pulled out the crystal and shouted the words the fortune teller had taught me. The ringmaster spun around, his face changing into something horrible, something that hadn't been human for a very long time. "Stop him!" he roared, but it was too late. I smashed the crystal against the ground. There was a sound like 1,000 mirrors breaking all at once. The carousel horses froze mid-movement. The hypnotic music stopped, and suddenly, everyone could see the carnival for what it really was. The tent wasn't beautiful anymore. It was old and rotten. The acrobat twins screamed as they merged into one twisted shape. The candy vendor's cart spilled open, revealing not candy but human teeth. Parents grabbed their children and ran. The missing kids, including Tommy, began to wake up from their trance. But the ringmaster wasn't done. He grabbed me with hands that had turned into claws. "You ruined everything," he shrieked. His skin was peeling away, showing something dark and ancient underneath. That's when Jake appeared with his tools. But this time, he wasn't using them to fix rides. He was using them to break the carousel's heart. The fortune teller joined him, throwing bottles that smashed against the machinery. Where the liquid touched, the carnival's magic hissed and died. "Run!" The fortune teller yelled at me. "Take the children and run. We'll hold it back." I grabbed Tommy and as many other children as I could reach. We ran through the chaos as the carnival began to collapse. Behind us, the rides were falling apart. The games were bursting into flames and the Hall of Mirrors was shattering. We made it outside just as the big tent collapsed. I counted the children. We'd saved 15 of them, including Tommy. But I could still hear screaming from inside, and I knew some hadn't made it out. The carnival burned all night. By morning, nothing was left but ashes. The fortune teller and Jake were never found. Some of the other carnival workers were found nearby. Now just normal people, old and confused about where they were. Tommy Richardson went home to his mother. He didn't remember much, which was probably for the best. The other saved children were the same. Their memories of the carnival faded, like a bad dream. But I remember everything. Sometimes I still hear the carousel music in my sleep. Sometimes I see the ringmaster's real face in my nightmares. And sometimes, when I pass a carnival, I look very carefully at the mirrors and the carousel horses, checking to make sure they're just normal rides, not hungry for children's souls. The police never believed my story, of course. They blamed everything on a fire and said the missing children had been kidnapped by normal criminals. Maybe that's better. Maybe some stories shouldn't be believed. But I know the truth. And I know something else, too. Not all of the carnival burned that night. Some pieces survived, scattered across the country. Sometimes I hear stories about strange traveling shows, about mirrors that show impossible things, about carousel music playing in empty fields at midnight. So if you ever see a carnival that appears without warning, that seems too good to be true, where the music never stops and the mirrors don't reflect quite right, don't go in. Don't let your children go in. Just walk away quickly and don't look back. Because somewhere out there, the Whispering Pines Carnival is trying to rebuild itself, and it's still hungry. My name is Janet Mitchell, and I've been a reporter for the Chicago Daily News for 7 years now. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I discovered in the old meatpacking district. Sometimes at night, I still wake up hearing the screams. It all started 3 weeks ago when my editor dropped a thin brown folder on my desk. 7 people have vanished from the meatpacking district in the last 2 months, he said, tapping the folder with his finger. Nobody's connecting the dots, but they're all linked to Mitchell and Sons Meat Processing. I remember feeling my stomach tighten at the name. The Mitchell family, no relation to me, thank goodness, had been running that business since my grandmother was a little girl. Their red brick building with its tall smokestack was like a castle overlooking the district, and Old Man Mitchell was practically royalty around here. Why hasn't anyone investigated this? I asked, flipping through the missing persons reports. The faces stared back at me. 3 workers from the plant, 2 health inspectors, a local beat cop, and a teenage boy who'd been delivering newspapers in the area. That's the thing. My editor leaned in closer, his coffee breath making me wrinkle my nose. 2 reporters from other papers started asking questions. One switched beats suddenly, moved to covering garden shows. The other one, he paused. Well, he quit journalism altogether. Moved to Florida, they say. Something felt wrong about the way he said that last part. I've been a reporter long enough to know when someone's hiding something. They say. I repeated. He shrugged. Nobody's heard from him since he left. I opened the folder again and studied the photos more carefully. 7 faces, 7 stories, 7 families wondering what happened to their loved ones. And underneath all the paperwork was a single black and white photograph of the Mitchell and Sons building, taken at dusk. Something about those dark windows made my skin crawl. There's more, my editor said quietly. The meat they've been selling. People are saying it's different somehow. Better, according to some customers. But others claim they found strange things in their packages. Things that shouldn't be there. I thought of my brother Tommy then. He'd started working at Mitchell and Sons 2 months ago as a night shift cleaner. Said the pay was too good to pass up. I hadn't heard from him in over a week. I'll take the story, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My editor nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he knew this wasn't just another assignment for me anymore. That afternoon, I walked down to Pete's Diner, just across from the Mitchell building. The lunch crowd was thinning out, but the smell of fried onions and coffee still hung heavy in the air. I slid into my usual booth by the window, the one with the perfect view of the loading docks. As I pretended to study the menu, I watched 3 massive delivery trucks pull up to the building. The workers who came out to unload them moved differently than regular dock workers, too stiff, too careful. Like they were handling something fragile or dangerous. An old man at the counter caught me watching. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away and hunched over his coffee. His hands were shaking so badly that coffee slopped over the rim of his cup. I pulled out my notebook and wrote, "What are they really shipping in those trucks? And why is everyone so afraid to talk about it?" Little did I know, I was about to uncover something far worse than missing persons and mysterious deliveries. Something that would shake this city to its core. If I lived long enough to tell the story that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Tommy and those trucks I saw at the loading dock. Around midnight, I tried calling his apartment again. No answer, just like the last dozen times. My stomach felt like it was tied in knots. I dug through my old family photos until I found one from last Christmas. Tommy grinning next to me, holding up the watch I'd given him. He never took that watch off. It was the kind that glowed in the dark, and he said it helped him see during his night shifts at Mitchell and Sons. The next morning, I put on my most professional-looking outfit and grabbed my press badge. My plan was simple. Walk right to the front door of Mitchell and Sons and ask for an interview about their award-winning meat products. Sometimes the direct approach works best, or at least lets you see how people react when they're trying to hide something. The lobby of Mitchell and Sons was all polished marble and dark wood, like a fancy bank. But something was off. The air smelled wrong. Not like raw meat or blood, but something sickly sweet that made my throat feel tight. Behind the front desk, a woman with perfectly styled hair smiled at me, but her eyes were cold as ice. "I'm Janet Mitchell from the Chicago Daily News," I said, holding up my press badge. "I'm doing a story on successful family businesses in the city. Would it be possible to speak with Mr. Mitchell?" Her smile didn't change. "I'm afraid Mr. Mitchell is very busy today. Perhaps you could leave your card." That's when I noticed something strange. Her desk had no phone. What kind of front desk doesn't have a phone? "Of course," I said, reaching into my bag. As I pretended to search for a business card, I accidentally knocked my pen under her desk. When I bent down to get it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a trap door in the floor behind her desk, with fresh scratch marks around the edges. Just then, the massive front doors opened. A group of men in expensive suits walked in, led by someone I recognized from the newspapers, Senator Williams. He'd been in the news lately, changing his vote on some big city contracts at the last minute. The men didn't even glance at me as they walked past, heading straight for a door marked private. The receptionist's smile was gone now. "Miss Mitchell, I'm afraid you'll have to leave." As I walked out, I heard a sound that still haunts me, a muffled scream, coming from somewhere deep below the building. But when I turned around, the receptionist was still sitting there, perfectly still, pretending she hadn't heard a thing. Back on the street, I pulled out my notebook and wrote down everything I'd seen. That's when an old man approached me. His hands were shaking as he handed me a folded piece of paper. "I used to work there," he whispered, "in the tunnels. There's things down there, things nobody should see. Find your brother quick, miss, before they take him to the lower levels." Before I could ask what he meant, he hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. I opened the paper. It was an old map of the district, showing a network of tunnels under the streets. And there, in shaky handwriting, someone had written, "They feed at midnight." My hands were trembling as I folded the map and put it in my pocket. I knew what I had to do next, even though it terrified me. I was going to have to find a way into those tunnels. But first, I needed to talk to someone who knew the truth about what was happening in that building. Someone who had nothing left to lose. The health inspector who disappeared last month, he had a wife, and I had a feeling she knew more than she was telling the police that Mrs. Anderson lived in a small yellow house at the edge of town. Her garden was overgrown, and unopened newspapers lay scattered on her front porch. When she opened the door, I could tell she hadn't been sleeping well. Her eyes were red and puffy, with dark circles underneath. "I'm Janet Mitchell from the Chicago Daily News," I said softly. "I'm looking into what happened to your husband." She started to close the door, but I quickly added, "I know about the tunnels under Mitchell and Sons." Her face went white. After a long pause, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she whispered, "but we have to talk in the basement. They might be watching the house." I followed her down creaky wooden stairs into a basement that smelled like old laundry and mothballs. Mrs. Anderson turned on a small lamp and pulled out a cardboard box from behind some boxes. "John, my husband, he kept copies of everything," she said, her hands shaking as she opened the box. "He knew they might come for him. The night before he disappeared, he brought these home." She handed me a stack of papers, inspection reports, photographs, and a small black notebook. The photos showed strange machinery in dark rooms, walls covered in rust-colored stains, and something that looked like giant meat hooks, but they were shaped all wrong. John said the meat they were selling. Mrs. Anderson's voice cracked. It wasn't right. The texture, the DNA tests, nothing made sense. And then he found the special auctions. "Special auctions?" I asked, flipping through the notebook. "Every month, they invite rich people from all over the country. They serve them special cuts of meat that cost thousands of dollars." John said. She stopped, wiping her eyes. He said he saw them taking live people down to the lower levels the night before each auction. My hands felt cold as I looked at the last photo. It showed a metal door with words scratched into it. "The hungry must be fed." "The night John disappeared," Mrs. Anderson continued, "he called me from the plant. He said he'd found proof of what they were doing. He was going to expose everything. Then I heard screaming in the background, and the phone went dead." She grabbed my arm. "But that's not the worst part. The next day, I got a package. Inside was John's wedding ring, and a receipt for meat he'd been processed into. I felt sick to my stomach. "Did you go to the police?" Mrs. Anderson laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "Detective Morris? He's at every auction. Half the police force is on their payroll. The other half is too scared to do anything Just then, we heard a car door slam outside. Mrs. Anderson ran to a small window and peeked out. Her face went pale. "Black car with tinted windows," she whispered. "They're here. You need to leave now. Take the back door through the garage." She shoved the box of documents into my arms. "Find the priest at St. Michael's Church. Father O'Connor. He knows about the tunnels. He used to help people escape from them. But be careful. Some people who go looking for the truth about Mitchell and Sons, they end up on the menu." I ran through her garage and out into the alley just as I heard knocking at her front door. As I hurried away, I heard men's voices and Mrs. Anderson crying. That night, I went back to check on her. The yellow house was empty. On the front door was a realtor's sign. For sale? Contact Mitchell Real Estate Services. I clutched the box of documents to my chest, my heart pounding. I knew I had to find Father O'Connor fast. But first, I needed to make copies of everything in case something happened to me. Because now I was sure of one thing. My brother Tommy wasn't just missing. He was somewhere in those tunnels. And time was running out to St. Michael's Church was old and gray, with gargoyles that seemed to watch me as I walked up the stone steps. It was almost sunset, and the stained glass windows glowed like dying embers. My footsteps echoed in the empty church as I walked down the aisle, clutching my bag with the copied documents. Father O'Connor was lighting candles at the altar. He was older than I expected, with white hair and hands that looked strong from years of hard work. When he turned around, I saw a long scar running down the side of his face. "You're the reporter," he said. "It wasn't a question. I've been expecting you. Mrs. Anderson told me to find you," I said, my voice bouncing off the high ceiling. Before she disappeared, he nodded sadly. Margaret Anderson was a brave woman. Like her husband, he walked over and locked the church doors. "Follow me. We can't talk here. The walls have ears, even in God's house." He led me through a heavy wooden door and down a narrow staircase to the church basement. The room was filled with old books and boxes, but in one corner was something that made me stop. A wall covered in photographs. Hundreds of faces looked back at me. The lost ones, Father O'Connor said quietly. People who went into those tunnels and never came out. I've been keeping track for 30 years. I saw Tommy's face among them, recently added. My hands curled into fists. "Why doesn't anyone stop them?" I asked. Father O'Connor sat down heavily in an old chair. "The Mitchell family has been running the city from the shadows since 1880. They don't just sell meat, they sell power. Their special meals, they change people, make them stronger but also more cruel, more hungry." He rolled up his sleeve, showing me a strange mark on his arm. I was young when I first found the tunnels. A boy from my parish had disappeared. I followed the signs and found their feeding chamber. His voice shook. What I saw there, no one would believe me. But I have proof now. He walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out an old leather book. This is their ledger from 1925. One of our people stole it during a raid. Look at the names. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, listing dates, names, and prices. Next to each entry was a small red mark that looked like a bite mark. "These are all people who went missing," I said, reading through the names. "No," Father O'Connor said. "These are their customers, the ones who eat the special meat. Look at the names: mayors, judges, business owners, even some priests." He touched the scar. "That's how they keep their power. Once you eat their food, you become one of them. And if you try to leave..." He gestured at the wall of photos. Suddenly, we heard footsteps above us. Heavy footsteps. Too many to be just a few people. Father O'Connor's face went pale. "They're here. They must have followed you." He rushed to a corner and pulled away a rug, revealing a metal trapdoor. "This connects to the old Prohibition tunnels. It'll take you close to Mitchell and Sons, but be careful. They use those tunnels too." He handed me a small silver cross and a flashlight. Go. Find your brother. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Come with me, I pleaded. He shook his head. Someone needs to keep recording the names. Someone needs to remember. As I climbed down into the tunnel, I heard the basement door burst open above me. Father O'Connor started praying loudly in Latin. The last thing I heard before I closed the trap door was men shouting and things breaking. The tunnel was cold and smelled like wet earth. As I switched on the flashlight, I saw something scratched into the wall. Delivery Route 6, fresh meat only. I took a deep breath and started walking. Somewhere ahead was the truth. About Mitchell and Sons, about my brother, about everything. I just hoped I was ready for what I would find. The beam of my flashlight showed footprints in the dirt, fresh ones, leading deeper into the darkness. And they weren't all human. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and my flashlight beam showed pipes running along the walls, some leaking strange-colored liquids. The air got colder as I walked deeper, and I could smell something metallic, like old pennies. I followed the footprints, checking my copy of the old map every few minutes. According to it, I was getting close to the area under Mitchell and Sons. That's when I heard it, a sound that made me freeze. Someone was crying. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wet wall. The crying was coming from somewhere ahead, echoing through the tunnels. It sounded like, "No, it couldn't be." "Tommy," I whispered. The crying stopped. Then a voice, weak but familiar. "Jan? Janet, is that you?" My heart jumped. It was him. I switched my flashlight back on and ran forward, following his voice. The tunnel opened into a wider space with several metal doors. Behind one of them, Tommy was calling my name. "I'm here," I said, running to the door. Through its small window, I could see him. He looked thin and scared but alive. "I'm getting you out." "No, Janet, you need to run." Tommy's eyes went wide with fear. It's a trod dash suddenly. Bright lights flooded the tunnel. I spun around, blinded, as footsteps echoed from every direction. When my eyes adjusted, I saw them, men in expensive suits surrounding me. And with them was Detective Morris, the cop who was supposed to be investigating the disappearances. "Miss Mitchell," a smooth voice said, "we've been expecting you." An old man stepped forward. I recognized him from photographs. Robert Mitchell himself, owner of Mitchell and Sons. He looked gentle, like someone's grandfather, but his eyes were cold and hungry. "You're quite the detective," he said, smiling, "just like those other reporters. But don't worry, we won't kill you. We have better plans." He pulled out a small key. "You see, our customers are getting tired of the usual menu. They want something special. Someone who's smart, brave, full of life." His smile grew wider. "Someone like you." "You're crazy," I said, backing up against Tommy's door. "People will look for me." Mitchell laughed. "Like they look for the others? Don't you understand yet? We own this city. The police, the politicians, the press, they all come to our special dinners. Even your editor." My blood ran cold as I remembered how my editor had first given me this story. Had he known? Had he sent me here on purpose? "Take her to processing," Mitchell ordered, "and make sure her brother watches. Family makes the meat so much more flavorful." The men moved closer. I gripped Father O'Connor's silver cross in my pocket. I had one chance, one crazy plan. I pulled out the cross in Janet Anderson's files. "Stop!" I shouted. I made copies of everything. The ledger, the photos, the customer lists, everything. If I don't make a phone call every hour, it all goes to every newspaper in the country. Mitchell's smile disappeared. "You're bluffing." I pulled out the copied pages. These names: Senator Williams, Judge Parker, Police Chief Roberts. Wonder what happens when people find out what they've been eating, what they've become. The men stopped moving. Mitchell's face turned dark with anger. Where are the copies? Somewhere safe, I lied, praying they couldn't hear my heart pounding. Let my brother go. Give me 1 hour head start and they'll stay hidden. Try to stop me. I held up the papers. And everyone learns the truth. For a long moment, nobody moved. I could hear water dripping and somewhere far away, someone screaming. Mitchell stared at me, and I stared back. Then he smiled again, but this time it was different. Hungry. Inhuman. My dear, he said softly, you really should have checked what was behind you. Before I could turn around, I felt something sharp stick into my neck. As the world started to go dark, I saw the door to Tommy's cell swing open. But Tommy wasn't inside anymore. In fact, he never had been. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Mitchell's voice. Welcome to the family business, Miss Mitchell. Dinner is served. I woke up strapped to a cold metal table. My head felt fuzzy, but I could hear machines humming and people moving around. When I opened my eyes, I saw I was in a huge room filled with strange equipment. The walls were lined with meat hooks, but they were bigger than any I'd ever seen in a normal butcher shop. Ah, you're awake, Mitchell said, stepping into view. He'd changed into a white butcher's coat, just in time for our special dinner party. We're serving reporter tonight, but something was wrong. He looked worried, and I could hear shouting, somewhere above us. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion that shook the whole room. Dust fell from the ceiling as more explosions followed. Mitchell grabbed a phone from the wall. What's happening up there? He shouted. His face went pale as he listened to the response. That's when I remembered my real backup plan. Before I'd gone into the tunnels, I'd mailed copies of everything to every newspaper in Chicago. Not just the documents, but my own notes too. I'd also called my old college roommate Sarah at the FBI with one simple message. If you don't hear from me by midnight, check the tunnels under Mitchell & Sons. The ceiling shook again. I could hear police sirens and people shouting through megaphones above us. FBI, this building is surrounded. Mitchell's face twisted with rage. You, he snarled at me. He pulled out a large knife, the blade gleaming under the harsh lights. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. But before he could reach me, the door burst open. Flashlights and gun barrels pointed into the room. Leading the team was Sarah, my old roommate, wearing an FBI vest. Drop the knife, she shouted. Janet, are you okay? Mitchell looked at the FBI agents, then at me, then at his knife. For a second, I thought he was going to try to fight. Instead, he started laughing, a horrible, empty sound. You don't understand, he said. You can't stop it. The hunger, it spreads. Ask your police chief. Ask your mayor. Ask anyone who's eaten our meat. They're all part of us now. Sarah stepped forward with handcuffs. Robert Mitchell, you're under arrest. As they led him away, I heard him call back to me. We'll be seeing you, Miss Mitchell. Everyone gets hungry eventually. The next few hours were a blur. The FBI found hundreds of people in the tunnels, some still alive, some not. They found Tommy too, locked in a different cell than the one I'd seen earlier. He was weak but alive. The fake Tommy I'd heard had been someone else, someone they forced to trick me. They also found the auction rooms, the processing chambers, and worst of all, the dining rooms where Chicago's most powerful people had eaten their horrible meals. The customer list went back decades. The story broke the next day in every paper in the city. Arrests were made, police officers, judges, politicians, even my editor. The Mitchell family's empire crumbled overnight. But sometimes late at night, I think about what Mitchell said, about the hunger spreading, about how many people had eaten their meat over the years. I still work as a reporter, but I don't cover food stories anymore. And when I walk past expensive restaurants and see rich people eating their fancy steaks, I can't help but wonder, are they really eating what they think they're eating? Tommy quit his job and left Chicago. Can't blame him. But he calls me every day, just to check in, to make sure I'm safe. Because we both know the truth. The Mitchell family didn't create the hunger. They just fed it. And somewhere out there, in other cities, in other places, someone's still feeding it. I keep the silver cross from Father O'Connor on my desk now. Next to it is a file of notes about missing persons reports from other cities, about other meat processing plants, about other wealthy families with long histories and special recipes. Because that's the thing about hunger. It never really goes away. It just finds a new place to feed.